You don't want to miss this one, folks. Unbelievably great discussion. I'm just back from Brownstone Institute conference in Hartford, Connecticut, and I caught up with Bret Weinstein in person. And we sat down and went through the great talk he gave there and explored it further. So this is a super duper one, folks. Enjoy. I'm here at Brownstone Institute conference, and a lot of smart people here and a lot of intellectual conversations about the state of the world. But I'm absolutely privileged to have met Bret Weinstein.
Very good to meet you.
Thank you, Bret.
Is your audience primarily Irish?
No.
No. So I don't have a
Minority.
sexy accent.
No.
Yeah. All right.
I'm 50-50 UK US, because after COVID my UK thing exploded. But Ireland's probably 4 or 5%. So you're safe. Yeah.
Okay, I hadn't thought about it that way. But all
So
right.
you're talking to a lot of Yanks and a lot of Brits, probably.
A lot of Yanks and a lot of Brits. All right, I've been there.
Well, you know, I said to you yesterday, this is truthful, this is not flattering. I said to you at the end of your talk, you know, I could listen for the rest of the evening to this stuff. It's just fantastic. But we might start off with just one of the elements from your talk that you started off with was the scientific method. And to say that that resonates with me is a gross understatement, because of my background. So maybe just talk a little, as you did, on the principles.
Sure. My point really is that the scientific method is simple, largely forgotten. Even most of the stuff that is passed around in scientific journals doesn't meet the standards. The scientific method is cumbersome, but it has one attribute that makes it superior to all other methods for figuring out what's going on and making sense of the world. The one thing that it has going for it is that it is self-correcting. It will tell you what you need to know rather than what you want to hear, if you do it right. If you do it wrong, it won't. If you do it wrong, it will tell you exactly what you're expecting, and we see an awful lot of that dressed up as science. But the point I was making in my talk is, for those of us trying to piece together the meaning of what we see taking place in public, the claims that are made about phenomena, the claims that are made about who's in the right, who's spreading disinformation, these sorts of things, that this is the toolkit to use, and that it produces a product that allows us to evolve in the direction of greater insight. The product is predictive power. If you have a model, and I'm not talking about a computer model, we can get back to computer models a little later, but if you have a cognitive model of the universe that has greater predictive power than competing models, then it is closer to the truth. And so what we really ought to be tracking is how well people making various claims are at spotting things that nobody believes but that turn out to be true given time. All right? So scientific method is the toolkit, even though most people think of it as tightly connected to things like laboratories and, you know, carefully controlled experiments. That's not really what it is. It is a logical tool for deducing, for finding signal buried in noise.
Absolutely, and the predictive is so important. And it just occurred to me as you spoke there, there's a meme that goes around with around 50 kind of nice weather crisis predictions, and 0 of them came true. So I guess they're not really following the scientific method in the whole climate thing.
Oh, and this is not just climate science, but the thing about science is that the method is extremely powerful. At the same time, it is fragile. And this is people, when they hear that something is powerful, they tend to think it is strong and robust, and that is not the case. This is a delicate process, and it depends on whether you're doing the philosophical part correctly. If you do the philosophical part correctly, it will work no matter what. If you break the philosophical layer and you do things that look really sciencey, but there's just a little bit wrong at the level of whether or not, for example, your hypotheses and predictions preceded your experiment, right? It just doesn't work at all. So most people who studied science, even though PhD means you have a doctorate in philosophy, most of the people who have a PhD in science didn't spend any time at all on the philosophy. In fact, most of them would probably tell you that the set of steps to the scientific method that we all encountered in grade school is somehow archaic, and that science has moved on and that we have more sophisticated ways of doing it, which is just simply not true. The philosophy of science works no matter what era you're in, and it doesn't matter whether you're doing a high-tech experiment in, an expensive laboratory, or you're wearing rubber boots and carrying a machete and, doing science in the jungle, right? The question is, are you doing the philosophical part correctly? So, in climate science, what we have is the destruction of the philosophical layer based on a subtle selection criterion. If you were to publish a study that said that our concerns about climate change were overblown by 50%, you'd wreck your career, right? Even admitting that climate change is a problem, it's just not quite as bad as we thought, is sacrilege. And it doesn't take very much selection over very much time to boot out the people who have an instinct to figure out where, we've gotten ahead of ourselves, and to leave what is essentially the faithful behind, who will keep publishing papers that say, oh, it's actually worse than we thought, and then the reviewers are of the same mind because they've been selected by the same process, and lo and behold, what you have is journals full of stuff that looks exactly like science, but doesn't have the key ingredient. And actually, if I can say one more thing, this was brilliantly described by Richard Feynman in his Cargo Cult Science essay, which I think started as a commencement address, probably at MIT. But anyway, his point was that there were, even in his time, there were vast swaths of what appeared to be science that were just simply not right. They had all of the characteristics that you would expect. The people were dressed correctly, they spoke with the right terminology, they published in the right way, they went through all of the processes, but what they produced was effectively opinion, because they weren't doing the method correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And Feynman has some great quotes from that period as well. You talked as well, because I want to hit on a few more aspects of your talk, and I'm just going from memory, but complexity versus complicated nature, they're very different. So maybe you could just kind of capture that.
Sure. Most people on hearing complicated and complex will think of them as something like synonyms. And that's because from our perspective, encountering these things, they're often indistinguishable, right? The fact that you sit down at a computer and you compose a word processing document but couldn't explain thing one about what's going on under the hood, it's a black box to you. But it's a very different black box. That's actually a complicated device, but completely understood, maybe not by any individual. It's possible that, the number of people who could explain the chemistry inside of the battery and who could explain the way the information is managed at the level of the transistors, maybe, there's only a tiny number of people who could give you both stories. But we could assemble a room of people who can completely understand your laptop if we gave them enough time, right? It's a complicated system. There's nothing unpredictable about it. Complex systems are fundamentally unpredictable. We can get into a philosophical argument about whether or not we will one day understand enough to fully predict them, but from our perspective, they are fundamentally unpredictable. And the thing that I see again and again is that people become expert in complicated systems, right? They wield them like a virtuoso. And then they think that they're going to walk into a complex system and that their experience applying what they've learned is going to allow them to manage it. And this results in catastrophes because you can't manage a complex system that way. It's going to keep surprising you, right? Every time you think, oh, I'm going to manage the system so it produces more of this thing that I want, you're going to get 16 unintended consequences, and you may well get less of the thing you wanted because of all the stuff you didn't understand about the way it's hooked up, right? And this is intuitive if you're a field biologist who is paying attention to frankly, the amazing complexity of nature. you realize, and in fact Darwin made this argument about these networks of connections that you could infer must exist, but you had no idea if you decrease this over here what effect it's going to have, you know, with that over there. And you know, we've seen this demonstrated many, many times. The reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone results in a different community of plants. It's incredible. But beware the people who become arrogant in the land of the complicated, who then gain power over the complex, because they're often powerful enough to destroy what is, and they're not powerful enough to produce something better, even if that's their intent.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. And at first I felt a little uneasy as you began the topic, because I have always said my history is as a complex multi-factor problem solver, and I've led teams, and I thought, oh, have I been, you know, dishonest there? But actually, as you talked, and I was thinking about this in parallel, when we start off with a very complex multi-factor problem in a complicated system with many, it is complex because we don't know what's going on, and we're working 80 hours a week. But when we found out how it works, it becomes a plain old vanilla complicated system. So it kind of is complex at first when you can't predict anything, and many times you are convinced by hypothesis. You do a controlled experiment, and without the control there is no science. That's the problem I have with the vaccine and all these technologies. You do an experiment and it throws you back a complete no. It's shocking. Mm-hmm. But later, when you actually find out what the interaction of variables actually is, very subtle, and you understand it, it's just complicated and everything's answered. But these guys you're talking about, these specialists segmented into their fields, their nuclear weapon, they are so dangerous. My whole career, the specialists are hugely dangerous. You have to corral them and manage them with some philosophy and wisdom, or they are just going to lead you straight into the fire. Just a very brief interlude here, just to give you a heads up, which I've discussed before, the importance, in my mind, of physical gold in your portfolio, whether it's pension or personal savings, etc. We're talking here in this interview about some pretty heavy things upcoming, and very important, I believe, to have physical gold as a hedge, security against many of the things that may occur in the coming years. So I have a relationship with Pure Gold in UK, in the city of London, and they are the best in my mind. And we have a special offer that they have given to me for followers or viewers, and it's basically free storage for a period and also free consultation with their financial experts, not just on physical metals but on the broader spectrum. So I highly recommend you check them out, get a free consultation. The link is down below, and with that, let's get back to Bret.
So I'm often struck by the fact that it's funny. A lot of things turn out to be fractal. One of the problems is that science is embedded in a complex system of its own, a human cognitive complex system. And it has been decimated by very subtle, mundane changes in the way we cause it to happen. So we tend to think, if you haven't delved deeply into the philosophy of science, you tend to think that science is almost synonymous with reductionism. That the idea is you're going to get all of the noise out of some system so that you're looking at only one property at a time, and you're going to figure out what that property's consequence is. Okay, that is scientific, but it's half of a process. You can't just do that, right? The other thing is you've got to take what the specialists are able to deduce by purging the noise, you know, with a laboratory, for example. So they're looking at one parameter at a time. And then the other, I would argue, absolutely equally important part, which has almost been lost, is synthesis, right? Where you take all of the things that the specialists learn and you say, all right, now that I know these 16 parameters, and I know that there are 100 other parameters I haven't spotted yet, what's the best story I can tell about how they fit together, right? So the reason that synthesis has been lost is about the way science is funded. Doesn't seem like it should be important, but here's the problem. Universities are fueled by something called grant overhead, as you know. Grant overhead means that when somebody gets $1 million grant, $500,000 or more goes to the university, right? to keep the lights on, to keep the buildings functional. So the universities become obsessed with people who bring in grants. Okay. The bigger the grant, the better, which has two consequences. One, they do not have an incentive to hire people who run more elegant experiments, which tend to be more insightful experimentalists, because the bigger and more expensive the experiment is, if you can convince the federal government to throw more money at you because your experiment's inelegant, or because you're testing something that doesn't need to be tested because the answer is actually obvious before you even get to the laboratory, you're gold from the point of view of the university. So the university ends up hiring numbskulls who can figure out ways to propose more expensive experiments and make them sound necessary. Okay, that's dumb. But the other part is it has no incentive whatsoever to hire theorists. And the problem is you need the theorist to do the synthesis part, right? But the problem is, what do you need if you're a synthesist? I mean, if you're a theorist, you need a computer, a library, a room that's quiet, right? It's not expensive. And so the university looks at it as a line item that can be reduced to zero, and what you get is experimentalists, reductionists, who have to step in and do the theory, and it's just embarrassing, right? When they get to the theory, they're not good at it. And so they come up with cruddy theory, which results in stupid experiments that don't need to be run, and it's like a totally predictable train wreck.
And you know, I'm thinking, I can't help but think of the parallels. The university system is exactly as you describe, and it's a race to the bottom scientifically. And the irony is, for all my stresses in corporate, it was the exact opposite. Because the only thing that was valued was the quarterly, the money, and to prevent losses. So you had to have what we called integrators, the most valued role, with hundreds of engineers working on a $500 million program. The integrators were gold because they did the synthesis.
Right.
And they managed all the specialist engineers in physics or chemistry or whatever. And they were highly valued. So the evolutionary process actually got amazing results.
It's
works the opposite.
Because you get paid for coming up with something valuable.
Yes.
Not for coming up with something that sounds sophisticated.
That gets a grant in.
Right. Now, I wouldn't say it's the exact opposite, because I often compare our current scientific mode to the historical mode, which had its problems, to be sure. Gentlemen scientists, here's the problem. Gentlemen scientists, it was an elite. It's a very tiny pool. That means you're not getting the people with the best capability to do it. But it had one advantage. The age of gentlemen scientists was an age in which these people weren't doing the work in order to buy a boat, right? These people were doing the work because they wanted to advance the ball, maybe for selfish reasons, maybe because they wanted their name to be remembered 500 years after they were gone. But it didn't matter. There was no point in fooling people and making something false sound true, because what you were really after was whether or not your work stood up and was understood to be important by your descendants.
In fact, you'd be remembered for the wrong reason, so they'd actually be fearful of that. They'd be found out if they came up with crap.
Right, and it would all be for naught. So, and interestingly, Darwin was a wealthy gentleman scientist. Wallace was not. Wallace was actually, interestingly, working class. He was the counterpoint to this story. And interestingly, the first thing Darwin does in The Origin of Species is make an argument that Wallace should be taken care of. It's a fascinating little tale. It's something that would never happen in science now. But anyway, the example you give of the corporate mode in which synthesis is preserved because it actually pays, you don't want to limit that to it pays on the balance sheet in a way that the shareholders see it as valuable. What you want is a system that actually says the more significant a conclusion is, and the farther ahead of its time it is, the more valuable it is to us. You want us to spot stuff that may not manifest in a profit for 100 years, right? And the corporate structure won't do that very well.
And that is so true, and it resonates with more of my experience in corporate. One challenge we have is the person who could look ahead proactively and predict a future problem and prevent it was never rewarded properly. Because avoiding a problem in corporate world, it's, well, the problem didn't happen, so yeah, I guess. Whereas fixing a problem was often eulogized, even though that's retrospective by its nature. Now, mostly I never caused problems or missed them coming. I was actually called in wherever there was a problem, so that wasn't my fault.
Right.
So it was okay. But still, that's the weakness.
Now, here I won't tell the whole story because it would take too long. But when I was a graduate student, I was just out of pure interest studying an evolutionary problem that I found compelling. And hold on, I'm going to have to go back to that. I'm going to figure out, there was an example I was hunting for here. Oh, it was whether you get paid to fix a problem.
Oh yeah, I was talking about you get respected for the retrospective fixing it, but you should be looking forward. Yeah.
All right, forgive me. I'm not going to tell the whole story because it will take too long. But when I was a graduate student, I began work on a project just out of pure interest, an evolutionary puzzle that had existed in the literature from long before I was born, that I had an insight and I thought I would follow it. So I was just more or less entertaining myself doing something that was productive in my field. But I stumbled over a barrier into a place where there was, it was high stakes. There was money and other things that hung in the balance. And I didn't realize that the rules changed when you crossed that boundary. I discovered it once I had tripped over it. But what happened was, I was looking at the process of senescence, that is the pattern of creatures like us becoming feeble and inefficient with age. And I realized that this old hypothesis about why that happens to us dovetailed with some things that had been discovered recently as technology had improved. So I was working on the idea that we grow feeble and inefficient with age because we have a system that protects us from cancer, and that system fundamentally limits the number of cellular replacements that you can do in each tissue over a lifetime, so it condemns you to to fail because you can't keep adding new cells. In any case, this hypothesis that I came up with solved so many separate problems that I was absolutely sure it had to be true. There was no way the number of things that I saw would line up if it wasn't true. But there was one thing that absolutely refused to give and falsified the entire idea. Right? The thing was, the mechanism that limits the number of cellular divisions is something called a telomere, which is a repetitive sequence, a genetic sequence at the end of chromosomes that shortens slightly every time a cell divides, and there's a point at which it's grown critically short and the cell refuses to divide anymore. It's called a Hayflick limit. And the idea that that Hayflick limit might be a feature rather than a bug because it prevents tumors made a lot of sense. Every mole you have turns out to be a would-be tumor that got arrested at the Hayflick limit, something that I called a prototumor, a term that's never caught on, but it turns out to be accurate. Okay, so elegant explanation. We grow feeble and inefficient because otherwise we'd be overrun by tumors, and selection has delicately balanced these things to extend our lives navigating between these two hazards. But mice have ultra-long telomeres and very short lives. They have telomeres way longer than humans, and yet they don't live very long, so
that's
false.
The ugly fact that slays a beautiful hypothesis. Feynman, I think, said that, did he?
Oh, I don't remember him saying that, but yeah, the ugly fact. But the thing is, it's not even a scientifically legitimate thing to do. It's just a hunch. All of the questions that I knew existed in this landscape that were answered by my hypothesis told me, you're missing something. There's something you don't know. And so I stuck with it even though my hypothesis had been falsified by this one observation. And at first I thought maybe this is one of these cases where one person has measured the telomeres of mice, their experiment was contaminated, and everybody else has just been repeating the same thing ever since. Nope.
Wishful thinking.
Wishful thinking. It had been tested 12 different times by a bunch of different labs, and they all came up with the same thing. Mice have ultra-long telomeres. Like, what the hell is going on? Well, it turned out, through a series of stumbles and blind alleys, that I found the answer. The answer was mice do not have long telomeres. Laboratory mice have long telomeres. So I hypothesized that, and Carol Greider, who has now gotten a Nobel Prize for her discovery, her co-discovery of the enzyme telomerase, which adds length to telomeres, she and her then graduate student Mike Heeman tested my hypothesis, and they showed, eureka, wild mice don't have long telomeres. So that told me there was something going on in the colonies of the mouse breeders that elongates telomeres radically. And I have the only hypothesis that remains standing for what that is. That one hypothesis that could in principle explain this is that those colonies are interfered with by an economic phenomenon. Mice breed slower the older they are. So mouse breeders, in an effort to be economically efficient, only breed young animals. They throw them out after 8 months. That's not long enough for these animals to get tumors, so the selective force to keep the tumor prevention system running is eliminated in the colonies, which unbalances the trade-off. So they evolve in the direction of long telomeres because it keeps them functionally young for that entire 8-month period, and the fact that they all die of cancer doesn't matter. It doesn't have a selective impact because they've been eliminated from the colony by the time it happens.
And the breeding is highly selected generation after generation.
So it takes over the colony like wildfire. Okay?
Wow.
Now here's the kicker though, where this comes back to your point. Those animals with their broken telomeres, doesn't have to be that way. I can describe to you the protocol that would be used to breed them without causing this problem. To this day, as far as I know, they're still bred with the same protocol. But it breaks them from the point of view of studies of really important stuff, right? Cancer, wound repair, aging, and, most importantly, drug safety. We use these animals to test drugs to see if they're toxic. The problem is, if you have ultra-long telomeres and therefore your tissues can replace themselves indefinitely, if you give them a poison and it doesn't outright kill them, not only does it not show up as toxic, but it may even make them live longer because they are all brewing tiny little tumors, and if you give them a poison, it functions like chemotherapy. Okay? So, when I realized this, mind you, I now realize naive graduate student. When I realized this, I thought, I know they're not going to like it, probably aren't going to like me, but they have to fix it.
No, they don't.
Yeah. Well, not only no, they don't, but they have a reason not to, right? They actually have two reasons not to. When I approached Carol Greider, who has pretended that this whole episode didn't happen and stopped talking to me and didn't cite my work when she published her test of my hypothesis, but when I contacted her and I was like, Carol, this is incredible. Where are you going to publish that work so I can cite it in my paper, my evolutionary paper on this topic? And she said something that now rings in my ears. She says, we're actually going to keep it in-house. I did not know what she was talking about. Why would you have... She ran this experiment that was going to be absolutely a bombshell. The mice we're using for all of our mammal studies are broken. That was going to be a big paper. Why would she keep it secret? Well, the answer is it's actually like having a crystal ball. If you know how the mice are broken and nobody else understands it, then you can predict experiments like you have an insight into the biology, when really you just have an insight into the brokenness of this one apparatus. So there's a perverse incentive not to fix the problem, and by not fixing the problem, our drug safety system, as far as I know, still uses these animals which are biased in the direction of telling us that toxic drugs are safe. Now, whose interest does that serve?
Of course. So it's perfect. It's just, and it's an element of too big to fail. You know, small errors that are slightly advantageous for these mega industries, you know, maybe if there's a bit of spotlight, let it go. But not big ones. Not big ones.
This one, actually, the Vioxx scandal.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Here you have a drug thought to be safe, released into humans, does heart damage, which I don't think is heart damage. It does body-wide damage, and we notice it in the heart because the heart is special. But, okay, so you've got a drug creates a major scandal. How did that get through drug safety testing? Fen-phen, Seldane, erythromycin. We have a long list of drugs that have had that exact pattern. Seemingly safe, released into people. Turns out they do heart damage. My claim is that is actually predicted by this model based on broken mice and their ultra-long telomeres. Federal government did a study, released a 300-page book on the future of drug safety. Doesn't mention mice, doesn't mention the genus mus, doesn't mention telomeres. Ignores the entire topic.
Absolutely. And then it just triggered the memory of one of the COVID vaccines. Wasn't it 9 mice were used, and they ran with it based on 9 mice.
May they rest in peace.
Oh my God. Well, here, you know, Bret, this has been superb, but I'm conscious of your time. So I wonder, might we finish on other elements of your talk where we talked about the future and the outlook. There were some people in the room here at Brownstone Institute, and do subscribe, by the way, guys. I'll put the link down below. But some people were kind of negative about the future, and some were very positive and thought, hey, there's an awakening. It's all to play for. You know, I'm somewhere in the middle, you know, on the razor's edge. But what do you think around that discussion? You did touch on it.
Yeah, in fact, I think I coined a term here. Oh. Dark optimism.
Dark optimism.
Dark optimism. And so, you know, I spent a lot of time looking at all of the horrors that have overtaken civilization. And believe me, I think I know as much as anybody about the danger that we're in. But I don't think we're cooked yet. And there are some things that work in our favor. You know, it's strange. The folks that have wrecked civilization have antagonized all of the competent, insightful, courageous people, and they've shoved them out of all of the institutions. So all those people are now awake, and we've come to find each other, and you know, we are outgunned. We don't have the institutions or any of the resources at their disposal, but we've got all the people that you would want on your team. So anyway, were this a movie, it would fit perfectly, right? You've got this ultimate collection of people. You know, it's an eclectic group of weirdos, but you know, makes for a pretty good narrative, and we know what we're up against, more or less, and we're ready to fight because, frankly, the alternative is unthinkable. So, I do think, I don't know how this movie ends, but if it were a movie, I know how it would end, and I think everybody needs to behave as if this is a movie and they know what scene it is, and the point is, you know what? I want to be the kind of person who would be on the right side in that battle. I don't want to be the kind of person who would sideline myself, and I don't want to be on the wrong side, and that means that as frightening as it might be to actually go to work to rescue civilization from the people who are endangering it, it's what we got to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's all to play for, and there are no choice. Like, even, I think I mentioned to you when we were chatting about Dr. Jakob Nordengard, he got kicked out of the university, and I commiserated, and I said, whoa, Jacob, that's tough. And he said, yeah, but I have no choice. With what he knows about Rockefeller and who's doing all of this, he has no choice. He has children.
Right.
And there was another phrase I loved. I forget who said it, but the warrior, or the real warrior, fights as if he is already dead. Mm-hmm. Because you must go for gold, or we are ruined, you know. Well, last thing, and I nearly forgot it. You've got something going on next week that'd be good to get out there.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah, so
I almost forgot.
Yeah, we both nearly forgot.
Yeah, we are putting on an event in Washington, D.C. on the Capitol Mall. Yes, that's a little bit frightening, but the idea that it is frightening for Americans to show up on the Capitol Mall and exercise their First Amendment right tells you that we must do exactly that.
Yes.
Okay, right? If that is a problem, it must be confronted. So we are going to go, we're going to face our fears, and we have an incredible lineup of speakers and musicians and comedians who are going to, starting at noon on the 29th of September, put on a heck of a show, and we are going to, I think, gather a representative sample of the vast unity movement that has emerged, that has blown through ideological differences, has become post-partisan, and we're gonna meet each other, and we're going to hear each other, and we are going to begin to galvanize as a force, hopefully a force of nature, that is capable of rescuing the Republic at this dark hour.
Excellent. And that is the link I will actually put down below to whatever the best link is. And actually, Bret, there's one final thing I remember from your talk. You had a feeling, based on a methodology, make a potential prediction. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. You figure there's a probability that something pretty significant may happen to try and disrupt the unity movement around October. Right? You don't know that, but maybe we'll just talk about that and get it on the record in case something does.
Sure. Now, I will tell you that prediction is the coin of the realm, but it's a little like batting. Batting 1,000 is not a thing, right?
Yeah.
So I'm perfectly ready for this prediction to be incorrect, and in fact, I really hope it is. But I do believe that the thing that frightens those who have taken over our system and corrupted it is our unity. And because we are finding our footing, and because much hangs in the balance in the next 50 or so days before the election, that the danger of an October surprise that disrupts the forces of good is through the roof. Now the question is, what would the October surprise be? And I will tell you, from my experience as part of the medical freedom movement, that October 7th was a uniquely disastrous phenomenon from the point of view of people who had otherwise become powerful and come to understand each other and were working in a coordinated direction. The energy around Israel and other phenomena in the neighborhood is tremendous. It's like a powder keg. And the divisiveness of the issue in any coalition is not to be underestimated. So the question of whether or not something lights that powder keg, either in very late September or early October, in order, well, I don't want to say in order, who knows why, but the prediction is that something of that nature will emerge, and it will cause the unity movement, which is finding its footing, to fracture, because that eliminates a hazard to the powerful and the theater and puppetry that they are otherwise involved in.
Yeah, and it was incredible. I saw it myself, Bret, with Professor Fenton and I think Eli David, people who were superb against the COVID madness. And then when that happened, we just lost them overnight. It was just, I couldn't believe it. And this may very well happen around the anniversary, I guess. Yeah, that would give it a little extra power.
Power and cover. Cover. And I don't know anything about how these people work, how they think, anything. All I know is what emerges in the world. And it will not surprise me at all if events unfold that overtake the conversation, that disrupt the Unity Coalition. And I do want to say, it's not just the folks who were on that side of the equation that fractured the movement. The movement fractures because it divides into two camps. Frankly, I think it falsely divides into two camps. Yeah. It's not that one of these camps is accurate. I believe there's a higher and more frightening analysis to be done, but the important point is any coalition can be destroyed by this. Any coalition of enough size to have people of both persuasions in it will find itself uncoordinated and back on its heels in such an event.
So the imperative as we close is, of course, as in the movie, I forget what it was, Master and Commander, the guy with the tattoos, hold fast. Mm-hmm. So if something happens, no matter how bad and how big and how extraordinary, and no matter what your personal affiliates in these matters, you hold fast to the main goal, which is to save the future for our children. And no matter how tragic any incident that happens is, it must be held at arm's length for everyone in this movement.
Right. That is, frankly, the only reason I would take the risk of saying this as a prediction is that if you see it coming, the ability to not fall for it and to recognize that no matter what your perspective is on what's taking place in the Middle East or its implications for Jews in the diaspora or whatever it might be, the future depends on us coming up with a system of rational governance that is in the interest of the people, in which we can navigate difficult issues through some sort of a method on a level playing field. All of that is bedrock. And if we get distracted by any issue that causes us to lose sight of that, we're cooked.
Absolutely. And the good thing, whatever about the prediction, that's a universal concept that we need to remind everyone of. So whether it's November or January, it does not matter. Always keep that in your mind. Focus on the real goal.
Yeah.
And that is it. Thank you so much, Bret.
It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, that'll do it, folks. Excellent conversation, I'm sure you'll agree. And I did mention Pure Gold. The links are down below to hedge against the future challenges. But also Trends Journal is an incredible value periodical, and it's a couple of books a week. I have a 10% offer. I'll also put the link down below, where Gerald Salente and his team look at all the media, all the newspapers all over the world from every side of the house. And then all their analysts put together predictions as to what's coming, where you can benefit from the changes that are coming, where you need to hedge, where you need to be careful. So the whole geopolitical and future sphere all clearly written down in excellent articles, and each week you can get an update on the latest. So it really is superb. It's a trivial price for what they're giving, and as I said, there's a link down below at 10% off should you wish to get hold of this super journal.